Welcome back. We're joined this week by Joel Fitzgibbon, Chief Government Whip, Chris Kenny, a Sky News contributor, Peter Bentley from the McKell Institute, and Liberal frontbencher Susan Lee. I want to talk about the Olympics. Everyone's talking about it, of course. Everyone's watching it the last couple of weeks. There was disappointment in the first week, I think, that we weren't performing all that well, but thanks to the sailors, kayakers, Anna Mears, Sally Pearson and a few others, we've lifted our gold medal count a little. It is an inevitable debate every 4 years, though, when we seem to not meet expectations of some. Do we put enough money into sport, and particularly the elite level? Chris Kenny, I don't think either side of politics is arguing more or less should go into sport, but there's always this argument about how the pie is carved up, funding for elite as opposed to local level sport. What do you think? Have we got the right mix?
Look, I think it's probably around about right. A lot of grassroots sport gets a lot of funding, and of course a lot of grassroots sports and sports people and kids look to the elite for their inspiration, so it's about right. And
so it is important, you think, to have gold medals won at Olympics?
I think any serious country, especially a country like Australia that's got a proud tradition in sport, has to support elite sports. And I think perhaps the story we should be talking more about out of these Olympics is what's happening in England and China is in part a reflection on how professional we've been about sport in this country, because they've pinched our coaches.
Exactly, swimming in China.
Yeah, they've replicated a lot of our techniques, and it's rebounding against us, but good on them.
But I would disagree with Chris in that not in our attempts for gold, but in the kind of, it's almost the trickle-down economics of sport, you know, that we invest in elite sport and therefore we'll see community sport boosted. And time again, studies have shown this just isn't the case. And reviews have shown that despite the fact that it feels good to win gold,
so people aren't tonight going to sign up to their local kayak club?
They're not. They're not.
And because we won a gold.
They're not at all. And interestingly, some polling actually came out this week that showed it was about 60% of Australians think we're spending too much on our Olympic elite sport. So, no, I'm not here to
60%.
advocate. It was 58%, I think, was the exact figure. I think we're spending
this
too
is the
much.
essential poll.
That's right. Yeah.
I would describe that as bordering on push polling. You know, it was given we spend $70,000 on each gold medal. Do you think this is too much? And if you'd seen the figure, I forget what the figure was. I'd have said maybe as well.
How can you measure these things? Of course, young kids watching Stephanie Rice swimming, it's going to encourage them to keep swimming. You can't really measure that.
No. And I'm not advocating that we cut Olympic funding whatsoever. I'd like to put that on the record. But I think it is interesting that we naturally have this inclination to assume that the Australian people want more funding and we want more gold and we want to see more in Olympic sport. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think the conversation that we're having now is as a result of a few 100th of a millisecond in the pool. If we'd gotten a few more gold, we wouldn't be having it.
I'd sacrifice 2 or 3 gold medals for a Crows premiership. So,
But I mean, for a country of 22 million people, we've done really well to win 6 gold medals.
Yeah.
And when you look at the comparisons in China and the more populated areas of the world, you know, we've done really well. But it's not just about gold medals, and I mean, we can't pretend that it isn't about them, but when, for example, Magnussen missed the gold medal by this much, and we saw what it did to him as a person, and he said, look, I've learned more about myself in the last 20 hours than I have in the last 20 years. That was a lesson in personal development that I think every person, particularly every young person, would have taken away. And that is that in failing, in inverted commas, because of course it's not really a failure, you learn about yourself and you grow. And there are many different facets of competition that I think we pick up from the Olympics that make it really special.
We can still take something from
of course
that sort of performance, even if it's not a gold medal. But Joel Fitzgibbon, do you think we've got the right funding mix at the moment?
Well, David, we're not unique, I suspect, but Australians don't like to run second.
No.
And we've come off a very, very high base. We've punched above our weight in previous Olympics, and it's raised expectations and made this particular Olympics difficult, I think. And, you know, we have done very well in the silver. But I don't think it's so much about the quantum. It's not so much how much we spend. I think we're probably spending about the right amount. It's about spending smart. And I think it was Peter made the point that the world has been following our model. It's up to us now to innovate, to spend smarter, to find new techniques, to get out there ahead again, and I suspect we will. We've got some smart people around us.
A couple of other issues before we do run out of time. And in your portfolio area, Susan Lee, of childcare, the government has been talking a bit more about the issue of subsidising nannies, although the Minister, Kate Ellis, is now saying it's probably going to be a long way off. They'd need to be properly regulated. The whole sector would have to be regulated better before taxpayers' dollars are thrown at it. We know the Coalition are more interested in this area. You want the Productivity Commission to look into it. How would you deal with this issue of regulation, though? Because you want to make sure you've got a certain level of quality of nanny if you're going to throw taxpayers' dollars in.
Well, it's interesting. The Minister's initial response was, let's regulate, because Labor is very keen on regulating and interfering and taxing. But we have a plan.
You don't want to regulate.
We have a plan.
You don't want to regulate. You don't want to regulate childcare.
The Productivity Commission inquiry that we propose is recognising that the policy settings in childcare are out of date. Let's throw them all up in the air and see what comes down. Everywhere I go, I've had 27 childcare roundtables to date. I meet particularly mothers who say, I'm not participating in the workforce to the extent that I want to, that I'm trained for, or that makes my family life happy. So if we can look at childcare that takes place outside traditional long daycare hours, that has got to be a good thing.
Because you've got a lot of more shift workers.
The nurses, the policemen, the firemen, they can't get childcare at the hours that they work. And so they're often not doing the job they're trained for, or their family is under pressure, or grandma is under pressure, and so on. But what we're suggesting is not that every individual get over-regulated in this space, but there are opportunities for long daycare centres to manage places, to broker places, as they do with in-home care places right now. The last thing I'd like to see is regulation land on the family. But also, we would never extend the childcare rebate to someone who unstacks your dishwasher. We know that this is about early learning. This is about a process that takes place very successfully at the moment.
So it has to be someone with a certain level of qualification.
Well, either formally or informally, they have to pass a test, just like they do in working. Well,
formally pass the test. You want accreditation, but you don't want regulation. I don't understand.
No, we want to recognise that there are people who work very well in childcare and have for years that don't have a piece of paper that we would and should trust our children with. And if we get hung up on the qualifications, which your minister is doing at the moment, then we risk losing some of these really valuable women from the sector. So
it could either be you've got a qualification or you've got X number of years in the sector.
Yeah, I mean, let's not get hung up on what the piece of paper should be. So you want to regulate it? Well, the regulation doesn't need to happen at the coalface with families involved as, filling out paper and turning, as family daycarers have to, their homes into mini childcare centres for accrediting and licensing purposes. But I'm saying enough regulation to make it work properly. Let's not over-regulate it out of existence. And let's have an open mind to these things.
So there's the good regulation as opposed to bad regulation.
I'm a liberal and I don't like regulation, but I know that it's necessary sometimes.
I think Susan makes a really interesting point in talking about early childhood learning, and it's something kind of we as a society, when kids are 0 to 5, it's a cost, but once they hit 5, it's an investment in their education. And as you know, studies have shown that we really need to, from a productivity point of view, from an early childhood learning point of view, we need to be looking at education and how we can actually be kind of supporting our kids through that. Now, I personally think the nannies are a good proposal, but I think we do need to.
Are you saying we eventually, obviously a huge cost issue, we should eventually get to a point where early childhood education is supported by the taxpayer, is covered by the taxpayer in the same way primary and high school is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a long-term goal, but I think there is obviously a cost, and it's not a matter of just kind of, opening the chequebook. And a productivity commission inquiry is not a bad idea, but the
Chris,
point is...
I can see you shaking your head. You don't think kids need that...
Look, I have kids. I have a 6-month-old baby as well, so I'm looking at all this, but honestly... everything is going to be supplied by the taxpayers. Is it now? We've got a taxpayer government communications monopoly. Now we're going to have the government looking after our kids from when they're 6 months of age.
It's not about...
At some stage, you've got to get regulation and government out of people's lives, and you've got to allow people to make their own choices. And I think it's great that the opposition has started this debate and the government's joined it, that nannies might be part of the solution, a bit of flexibility.
Should the taxpayer be covering nannies?
Well, I would prefer to look at it as some sort of employment expense. It should be a tax deduction in some way and less regulated. But I can see the way we're headed. The first response is to regulate a new industry and get the government involved, and that goes against all my instincts.
But you can see the headlines, though, as soon as you don't have any rules around this. You know, a nanny with no qualifications flown in from who knows where, but getting a taxpayer-funded salary.
Well, that's why I wouldn't want it taxpayer-funded. I think that some sort of tax deduction is better. But I have this very old-fashioned idea that
they're doing the gardening or minding the children.
Well, you know, that strange idea, Joel. Back in the old days, I'm an old-fashioned guy, but you know, the best people to work out what is good for children is their own parents, and they should have a bit of flexibility into what they decide and what they choose. I don't want to hand that responsibility over to government regulators at sort of age 6 months.
It's a tricky issue, though. I mean, there are families, plenty of them now, in situations where they can't access formal childcare.
David, we want people to have children. It's good for our population growth. We want people to participate in the workforce, as Susan rightly identified. Now, we're subsidising them now, Chris, in childcare centres and long day care centres and elsewhere.
We are indeed.
So people are saying, well, if you can get a subsidy for having a child in formal care, why can't you have it in informal care? Well, that's I agree, it's a fine idea. Why would we discriminate? But regulating informal care, private care, is obviously more difficult. You can regulate a daycare centre, that's fairly easy, but it's pretty hard to identify who is the right or the wrong person to be certified to do it in someone's home. So what do? You have to regulate, Susan. I mean,
you do, and the Nannies Association wants regulation because they don't want to be seen as babysitters and childminders. They want their professional expertise in the area to be recognised.
And this actually benefits the nannies in terms of OH&S, super, employment.
But the fact that the response from the government was, first of all, regulation, not flexibility, not what do parents want, not the pressures that families are under, but, let's regulate it because it might get out of hand. It just shows the thinking.
Come on, Susan.
Which union are we going to sign up the nannies to? The nannies union.
Give me the example of over-regulation in this context. I mean, you just press this button. You know, your polling tells you that you talk about carbon as often as you can and mention regulation because Labor governments like regulation.
Carbon tax.
You know, you can't have it both ways. You want to support the informal industry, and you say, but you want light regulation, but you can't explain what that means. And you know, you don't want to be responsible for the first nasty front page, which grows out of an incident in a home because there wasn't proper regulation around this industry.
No one is suggesting that there wouldn't.
You tell me the difference between light and heavier regulation. I mean,
you said give me an example. A good example is family daycare, which is now being pressured by the same regulatory framework that this government is imposing as it would on a long daycare centre. So if you're providing care in your home, I've seen family daycares, well, many of them are exiting the industry, they're going out backwards fast, but they're setting up their garage to look like a mini childcare centre. It's not really the point of family daycare, it's about a family environment. I ask them why, they say we hate it. If we're staying in this industry, we hate what it's doing to the way we provide that special level of care. That's an example of a dead weight of regulation landing on something that it really shouldn't do, and taking away an option for families, so even less flexible childcare than they should.
But there is a broader point about regulation. Going back to Chris's point, no one here is suggesting a kind of Stalinist, you know, every child has to get in line and has to go off to the childcare centre. We have the best of both worlds. We have choice where you can decide if you want to send your children to a childcare centre, if you want to engage a nanny. You know, that's the choice and that's the libertarian, you know, for all of us. But if you do decide to do that, then you want to know that your children are being looked after by someone that's had a criminal record check, that has some qualifications, that is looking after them either in your own home or in a childcare centre, that doesn't have sharp implements in the backyard. And I think when it comes to children, this is something that regulation is a good thing because it's not just about, you know, the horrible front pages that any government would see. It's actually about children's health, their care and looking after them.
If government is going to be using taxpayers' money to subsidise that carer, then it carries with that a larger responsibility. You know, when something goes wrong, the headline is going to be much larger because this caring arrangement was subsidised by the taxpayers.
At the end of the day,
to manage it.
These are taxpayers' dollars, and whatever you do with them, you've got to spend them wisely.
Well, there aren't that many of them around, and this government has used an awful lot of them, and then some.
Well, yeah, we're spending more on childcare. That's right.
Well, you're also spending money. Just finally, you're also spending a lot of money on the national broadband network.
4 billion more today.
We heard 3 billion more today, and the deadline pushed back.
You are good.
Pushed back a further 6 months. Malcolm Turnbull, the Shadow Minister, made an interesting point on this today, that when you look at the complaints about electricity companies charging or over-investing too much to return a bigger dividend to the government, The NBN is also a government-owned monopoly that will be returning dividends to the federal government. Chris, is there a risk that we could see gold plating, or that we are seeing gold plating by the NBN at the moment?
I think there's no doubt about it. I was thinking about that as I was driving over the Sydney Harbour Bridge tonight, because Stephen Conroy has said that if Malcolm Turnbull and the Liberals built the NBN as the Sydney the metaphor, he said if they built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, they would have built it sort of just 2 lanes. And I think what Stephen Conroy's doing with the NBN is building the Sydney Harbour Bridge over every creek in Australia. You know, it's just over-invested in this infrastructure to an enormous degree. Everyone wants fast broadband. Everyone needs it, and the government needed to get involved with some sort of subsidies, especially for regional areas. But, you know, optical fibre cables to every home is too much of an investment.
It's a difficult thing, though, isn't it, Peter? How do we know what we're going to need in the future? Do we know that fibre optics to every home is going to be too much or enough, or the right mix?
Absolutely, and anyone that says they have the answer, I think is lying. But the fact of the matter is, you look at the big infrastructure projects over the years, the Snowy Mountain scheme, the Harbour Bridge, these sorts of things, you actually need to take a bit of courage and a bit of foresight and invest. And the benefit, the benefit when they were building these things is they didn't. Jack Lang, when he was building the Harbour Bridge, and Chifley, when he was building the Snowy Mountain scheme, didn't have a 24-hour opinion cycle, kind of always looking at. And now that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that's the fact of the matter. And there will be, overruns, there will be changes to the time, but at the end of the day, when we have this nation-building infrastructure, when we see our society, whether it's healthcare, we all are aware of the benefits.
But how's your broadband now? Have you got good broadband services now? Do you use broadband?
I do, but I use wireless.
But you're not on the NBN, are you?
Mine's pretty terrible, which is...
No, but this is the point. We do have broadband. It's
2 members representing rural constituents.
Sure. And you've got to look after it.
We've only got 30 seconds.
Well, actually, Joel wrote to the Newcastle Herald recently outlining the benefits of broadband for regional Australia. There's absolutely none in my electorate. There's some planned. You're investing $50 billion on this thing. No one's ever proved that it's good value for money. The time at which it returns a dividend is being pushed out, I think, to 2021 or something at the moment.
For the final completion.
And there is no one who has anything other than a vague promise in Western New South Wales about when or if it will ever appear.
Well, you can't have it both ways. You say we're gold plating, and now you're saying we're not doing anything. I mean,
well, I'd like to know
there's no advantage. If you're going to do a job, do it properly. We are doing it properly. We're going to be the best in the world. We're going to get a 7% return on the taxpayers' investment. And guess what? If you want to,
when are we going to do this?
A little way down the track, you'll have this enormous asset to sell if you want to.
Okay, so how many households are hooked up to the NBN right here?
That's what will happen. Telstra will end up owning it for half the price it cost to build it.
On that note, we'll leave that debate for another day. We're going to have to wrap things up there. But thanks all of you for joining us. Joel Fitzgibbon, Chris Kenny, Peter Bentley, Susan Lee. Thank you for joining us as well. We'll be back same time next week. I'm David Spears. Talk to you then. Bye.